The aircraft we're about to explore might look like something out of a science fiction serial, but it was the product of a very real wartime innovation. Conceived as an ambitious successor to the iconic Ju-87 Stuka, the Junkers Ju-187 was designed with a unique rotating tail section that still captures the imagination of aviation enthusiasts. Although it never reached mass production or saw combat, its story reveals a fascinating glimpse into how far wartime engineers were willing to go for any possible tactical edge. Let's embark on a journey through the Ju-187's remarkable history, technical innovations, ambitious uses, and ultimate fate, diving deeper into what could have been one of the most curious dive bombers in aviation history. To understand why the Junkers Ju-187 even came into existence, we first need to appreciate the reputation and role of its famous predecessor, the Junkers Ju-87, better known as the Stuka. The Ju-87 was the Luftwaffe's iconic dive bomber during World War II, lauded for its pinpoint dive-bombing accuracy and famously feared for its psychological warfare tactic of a wailing siren known as the Jericho trumpet. Whenever the Stuka sirens roared overhead, enemy forces on the ground, well, they knew trouble was on the way. It became an enduring symbol of blitzkrieg, fast and devastating strikes that aimed to disrupt the enemy before they could properly organize. Yet, by the early 1940s, as Allied fighters became more advanced, the Ju-87 began to show its age. It lacked speed, it had fixed landing gear that increased drag, and while it excelled in dive bombing, it fell behind in maneuverability and defensive capabilities. The Luftwaffe's success in the early stages of the war came partly from air superiority. Once the balance of power in the skies began to shift, well, the Stuka's vulnerabilities became far more pronounced. Allied fighter bombers started to overshadow traditional dive bombers in effectiveness, paving the way for a shift in German aircraft design thinking. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium, or RLM, or Germany's Ministry of Aviation, recognized that a modernized replacement for the Ju-87 was urgently needed if dive bombing was to remain a viable tactic on the ever-evolving battlefield. The design brief not only called for improved performance, meaning higher speed, better climb rate, and increased versatility, but also for solutions to the Ju-87's most glaring weaknesses, which included inadequate defensive armament and limited rear visibility. Junkers, the company behind the iconic Stuka, took it upon themselves to come up with a brand new design. They decided to address two of the most pressing issues in the Ju-87, its drag-producing fixed landing gear and poor defensive coverage to the rear. Thus, the concept of a rotating tail section was born. The idea was radical. If you can't get a rear turret gunner an unobstructed field of fire by conventional means, why not just move the tail itself? While the Ju-187 is often overshadowed by better-known aircraft of World War II, its conceptual roots remind us that sometimes an iconic design can run out of road, forcing engineers to push the boundaries of creativity. At the time, German engineers had already earned a reputation for futuristic ideas, from rocket planes to advanced jets. The Ju-187's rotating tail might be considered extreme, but it was very much in the spirit of the era's quest for any edge in aerial warfare. In a time when so many advanced aircraft concepts were on the drawing board, from the sleek Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter to the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet, the Ju-187 fit right into the broader picture of Germany's bold experimental designs. Yet not all of them would come to fruition. Many were canceled before ever leaving the blueprint stage, often due to shifting wartime priorities, resource shortages, or simply the harsh realities of combat conditions. The Ju-187 story stands as a prime example of an audacious idea that never got to prove its worth in the skies. By the time the Ju-187's concept was in development, the Luftwaffe's strategic needs had evolved significantly. During the early phases of World War II, the Ju-87 served admirably in the Blitz campaigns. Its gull wings and fixed spatted undercarriage became a hallmark of German tactical supremacy. However, by the late stages of the Eastern Front and the intensifying Allied bombing campaigns in Western Europe, Germany was playing defense rather than offense. Fighter bombers like the American P-47 Thunderbolt and British Hawker Typhoon began stealing the limelight. Capable of both air-to-air combat and precision ground attacks, these multi-role aircraft illustrated that the era of the dedicated single-purpose dive bomber was waning. Nevertheless, the concept of dive bombing still held certain appeal in some theaters. The ability to precisely place a bomb on a target by diving nearly vertical remained a potent tactic. especially for attacking fortified or pinpoint targets. If a new aircraft could couple the accuracy of the dive bomber with improved speed, climb, and defense measures, well, there still might be a place for it in the Luftwaffe arsenal. That's where Juncker's engineers aimed to pick up the torch. They understood that to remain relevant, a new Stuka would need more potent engines, retractable landing gear to cut down on aerodynamic drag, and better tailgun coverage to protect the aircraft from the increasingly common rear attacks by enemy fighters. The rotating tail assembly was a response to that last requirement, offering improved fields of fire and visibility, a critical advantage if the turret gunner was to successfully repel any chasing interceptors. It's also worth noting the industrial context. By 1943 and 44, Germany faced severe constraints in raw materials and manufacturing capability. The war effort demanded that existing designs be upgraded rather than building entirely new factories to produce unproven aircraft. Meanwhile, the cost of training specialized dive bomber pilots was pretty high. There was also a pressing need for design that could leverage existing Stuka pilot experience while still offering performance on par with newer Allied aircraft. The Ju-187 project, therefore, was not just about fancy engineering, but also balancing wartime realities, resources, pilot training, and the evolving nature of air combat. More importantly, there was a race against time. Every month that passed, Allied forces ramped up their production lines, churning out planes in astonishing quantities. Nazi Germany needed any advantage it could find. While the Luftwaffe's leadership recognized that jets and rockets might play a pivotal role in the future, they still saw the necessity for conventional or near-conventional aircraft to fill immediate tactical needs. This environment of extreme urgency fueled some truly unusual designs, and the Ju-187, it was one of them. Ambitious, borderline eccentric, yet undeniably clever in its objectives. At the heart of the push for a new Stuka was the premise that a specialized dive bomber, if improved enough to mitigate its vulnerabilities, could still find a niche where it excelled. Whether that was blasting enemy tanks on the Eastern Front or supporting ground forces in the West, the dive bomber's direct close air support role remained valuable. In that sense, the Ju-187, it wasn't just a vanity project. It represented a real attempt to adapt tried-and-true tactics to the rapidly shifting technological landscape of the mid-20th century. One of the most eye-catching aspects of the Ju-187 design was, of course, that rotating tail. Although early technical drawings are scarce, the concept proposed a vertical fin and tailplane assembly that could pivot 180 degrees. In normal flight, the tail would sit in a conventional position, but during combat or defensive maneuvers, especially when a rearward field of fire was crucial, the tail section would rotate out of the way, giving the rear gunner an unobstructed arc to engage enemy fighters. This design was envisioned to rectify the complaint that many turret gunners had with older aircraft. The tailplane often blocked large sectors of the potential firing envelope. But the rotating tail was only one part of the overall blueprint. Junkers knew that simply reusing the Ju-87's layout that wasn't going to suffice in the new air combat environment. They aimed for a sleeker fuselage, adopting a more streamlined form that would reduce drag and increase speed. Retractable landing gear replaced that classic spatted legs of the Stuka, both to improve aerodynamics and to lend the aircraft a more modern profile. Proposed power plants varied in the planning stages, but the design most commonly associated with the Ju-187 is the Junkers UMO 213, a liquid-cooled inverted V12 engine capable of producing well over 1,300 horsepower. This engine was a step up from the Ju-87's older power plants, promising a higher top speed, better climb rate, and the ability to carry a heavier bomb load. Some estimates suggest that the aircraft might have reached speeds of around 370 miles an hour, a significant improvement over the Ju-87's roughly 240 miles an hour. However, without actual flight tests to confirm, these figures remain theoretical. The fuselage design placed the pilot and gunner close together, enabling better communication and coordination. This was in line with Stuka tradition, where teamwork between pilot and gunner was crucial. The bomb load capacity aimed for at least the same as the Ju-87, roughly a 1,000 kilogram or 2,200 pound bomb, though many believe that it could potentially carry more if the airframe and engine performance proved sufficient. Dive brakes, a hallmark of the Stuka's dive bombing capability, were also intended to be integrated into the wing structure, ensuring the Ju-187 would still be able to perform near vertical dive attacks if needed. Weight distribution was a significant concern. If you're going to have a rotating tail, you need to ensure that the shift in the tail's assembly position doesn't compromise flight stability or cause undue stress on the fuselage. Engineers planned to reinforce the aircraft's midsection and piece certain components, like radio equipment and support braces, in such a way as to counterbalance any shifts from the rotating tail. Given the complexities, it's no surprise that the project required extensive wind tunnel testing to confirm that such a large moving component wouldn't disrupt airflow dangerously during flight. Adding to the complexities, the rotating tail needed mechanical reliability. The last thing any pilot or gunner wanted was a jam mid-flight, locking the tail in a compromised position. While final details did remain murky, it's believed that the design team intended a robust set of hydraulic or electrically driven actuators to accomplish this pivot. The system would have needed mechanical locks to secure the tailplane in both the standard and rotated positions. Moreover, the transition had to be done quickly and smoothly, especially in a combat situation where seconds can mean the difference between life and death. Still, the rotating tail concept represented a solution to a persistent dive bomber flaw: poor rear visibility and coverage. Considering the dire circumstances that Germany faced at the time, this kind of radical innovation was not only bold, but arguably necessary if the dive bomber was to survive in an era dominated by faster, more agile adversaries. Hey, look, you can't help but tip your hat to the audacity it took to propose literally flipping the tail around to solve the problem. Now, despite the ambitious design and early engineering studies, the Ju-187 project quickly ran into major hurdles. One of the biggest challenges was Germany's increasingly dire resource situation by the mid-1940s. Aluminum, steel, and other critical raw materials were in short supply, diverted to higher priority projects like jet fighters or experimental rocket planes. Additionally, the Luftwaffe was under enormous strain, with critical manpower shortages in both pilots and skilled labor. While Germany produced prototypes of many radical aircraft, the Ju-187 didn't get as far along in construction as some of its more famous contemporaries. There's still some debate among historians about whether a partial mock-up or a full-scale prototype was ever built. Some sources claim that at least one prototype airframe was started but never completed. Others suggest that extensive wind tunnel models did exist. Regardless, it's generally agreed that the aircraft never reached a stage where it made an actual test flight. Compounding the resource issue was a shift in strategic thinking. By 1944 and 45, the Luftwaffe's high command recognized that specialized aircraft like a dive bomber were becoming increasingly obsolete. Multi-role fighters were showing themselves capable of diving attacks with reasonable accuracy, but could also hold their own in dogfights. With Allied bombing raids devastating German cities and factories, the urgent need shifted to defensive interceptor aircraft rather than new offensive dive bomber designs. As the war turned against Germany, there was simply no place for a brand new Stuka successor in the rapidly shrinking budget of the RLM. Moreover, reliability and complexity concerns likely hampered the rotating tail concept. Even if resources had been abundant, the novelty of the design introduced significant engineering unknowns. In the heat of the battle, mechanical simplicity often wins out. The potential for the tail mechanism to fail or for the concept to create new structural weak points would have weighed heavily on decision makers. With no quick path to making the aircraft combat ready, it became a gamble that few in the higher echelons of the Luftwaffe were willing to take. Another interesting aspect was the rapidly diminishing role of close air support from specialized platforms in the German war machine. By late 1944, the Eastern Front, it was collapsing, and on the Western Front, Allied air superiority was nearly absolute. Even the venerable Ju-87 was more or less relegated to night harassment raids and limited anti-tank duties. Tank-busting variants of the Ju-87, equipped with 37mm cannons, and they were still used, but these missions were extremely risky. German ground attack squadrons began to rely more on the FW-190 fighter-bomber variants or the Bf-109 with bomb racks, as these aircraft could at least defend themselves in aerial combat, at least to some extent. All of these factors combined to diminish enthusiasm for the Ju-187. Despite its intriguing promise, it's a tale as old as warfare itself, a brilliant concept that just arrives too late or at a time when resources and strategic priorities had shifted elsewhere. The Ju-187 may have been the logical next step for the Stuka, at least in a perfect world, but in the brutal reality of the late World War II, that next step never materialized beyond drawings, mock-ups, and maybe a partial prototype. Now, if the Ju-187 had been fully realized, it would have carried an array of weaponry reminiscent of, yet more advanced than, the Ju-87. The primary offensive punch was planned to be a single large bomb. potentially up to 1,400 kilograms, or over 3,000 pounds, if the improved airframe could handle it, or multiple smaller bombs for cluster attacks. This payload capacity would have firmly placed it in the role of dedicated ground attack and pinpoint strike missions. The entire reason for a Stuka concept, after all, was that terrifyingly accurate dive bomb. But in terms of guns, the forward-firing armament might have included 2 or more 20mm cannons or 13mm machine guns, providing a measure of self-defense and ground strike capability. The real novelty, however, lay in its rear defensive turret. Traditional Stukas relied on a single 7.92mm MG-15 or MG-81 in the rear cockpit, with limited arcs of fire. The Ju-187's rotating tail was supposed to revolutionize this arrangement, potentially allowing for a heavier caliber machine gun or even a 20mm cannon, although such a large caliber for a rear gun would be unusual and would create recoil and weight balance issues. Still, the design's emphasis on rearward protection suggests that engineers were seriously considering how to bolster that weakness. Engineers recognized that a bigger engine, likely a UMO 213 or a similarly powerful inline engine, would not only enhance speed, but also high-altitude performance. Some warplanners envisioned using the aircraft in specialized anti-shipping roles in the North Sea or the Mediterranean, where dive bombing was still effective against a naval target. Others saw it as a tank buster on the Eastern Front, where the Ju-87G series with its underwing cannons had been moderately successful. The possibilities were wide-ranging, at least on paper. Now, in an ideal scenario, the Ju-187 would be faster, more agile, and better protected than its predecessor. Its ability to carry out steep dives for precision bombing runs was supposed to remain intact. The retractable landing gear would theoretically give it a more refined aerodynamic profile, boosting its maximum speed and range. With its rotating tail, the defensive arcs for the rear gunner would be unprecedented. The occupant of that rear seat, once the most vulnerable crew member in a typical Stuka, might finally have a fighting chance to ward off pursuers. But none of these projected capabilities ever made it beyond planning. No actual combat data exists, making it impossible to confirm whether the rotating tail would have truly offered such a significant advantage, or if it would have introduced new challenges, such as unbalanced flight characteristics. That uncertainty is part of the aircraft's mystique. It stands as a what-if in aviation history, an advanced dive bomber that, in another timeline, might have taken to the skies with fearsome effect. If there's one feature that sets the Ju-187 apart in the annals of experimental aircraft, it's that rotating tail. This singular aspect has captured the imagination of aviation buffs for decades. Why go through the trouble? Well, the answer is both simple, but still kind of complicated. Rear gunner positions in many World War II bombers, especially dive bombers, often suffered from obstructed fields of fire. The tailplane and empennage not only physically blocked the line of sight, but also forced turret gunners to operate in cramped conditions. And in a dive bomber, where the fuselage was more streamlined toward the tail, that space was even more limited. The rotating tail aimed to alleviate this bottleneck by literally moving the obstruction out of the way. Imagine a scenario where an enemy fighter lines up behind you. Flipping the tail fin around might give the gunner an uninterrupted shot. Now, in theory, this would have made any pilot thinking of a rear attack on the Ju-187 think twice. Yet, such an innovation comes with mechanical complexity. The tail would need robust pivot joints, bearings, and actuators. It would also need to maintain aerodynamic stability. The moment you move a control surface from its standard position, you risk messing up the airflow. And there's the risk of pivoting it at high speeds. Would you pivot it only at slow speeds, say during a climb or level flight, or could you do it in the thick of combat maneuvers? Every scenario introduced new questions. But nonetheless, the mere attempt at solving this problem in such an unconventional way exemplifies the outside-of-the-box thinking that characterized many late-war German designs. They were willing to explore any avenue if it promised an advantage. With the Allies gaining air superiority, the ability to defend oneself from the rear took on newfound importance. From the Stuka pilot who used the old Ju-87's vulnerabilities, the rotating tail might have seemed like a long-awaited dream. But despite all the excitement, we have to acknowledge the engineering challenges that were substantial. You had to control pitch, yaw, and roll, all while the tail pivoted, and that would have required advanced flight control solutions. Hydraulically or electrically actuated surfaces that can maintain stable flight no matter the tail's position. The risk of mechanical jams or partial rotations, it was ever present. Now, without modern computer-assisted flight controls, which were unheard of in the 40s, the design was borderline futuristic. One can only imagine the trials that would have been necessary to validate it. And even so, it's this radical solution that cements the Ju-187 in the imaginations of aviation enthusiasts and historians. In reality, you can't blame the engineers for wanting to push the envelope, especially during a time when the stakes were so high. Ultimately, the rotating tail remained a testament to the relentlessness and sometimes desperate innovation spurred by the exigencies of total war. So why exactly did the Ju-187 never progress beyond drawings and perhaps a partial prototype? Well, the simplest explanation is that the war situation changed too much too fast. By mid-1944, Germany was on the defensive on every front, east, west, and in the air. The once vaunted Luftwaffe was hard-pressed to defend German skies against massive Allied bombing formations. Focus shifted to producing defensive fighters like the Bf-109 and Fw-190 in bulk, and to developing advanced jet aircraft to challenge Allied superiority. Additionally, the Allies had largely solved the puzzle of the German Blitz. Tanks, artillery, and new fighter bombers had proven effective at countering Germany's tactics. The need for a specialized dive bomber was diminishing. Even existing aircraft like the Ju-88 and the Do-217 could be used in dive bombing roles or fitted for level bombing as required. They offer greater versatility and, crucially, were already in production. Another factor was cost. Prototyping and developing a brand new airframe with such an unconventional feature demanded a significant investment. As resources dwindled and factories lay in ruins from Allied bombing, the prospect of setting up production lines for an unproven aircraft became unrealistic. The RLM had to make hard choices, and among them was to streamline production of proven designs rather than chasing conceptual breakthroughs that might not arrive in time to help the war effort. Lastly, internal feasibility studies might have shown that the rotating tail, while ingenious, introduced more engineering hurdles than it was worth. We don't have complete archives. Many documents were lost or destroyed, but it's plausible that thorough wind tunnel testing revealed unforeseen aerodynamic issues, or that mechanical reliability of the pivoting mechanism remained in doubt. In the high-stakes environment of wartime aviation, a single flaw could doom an aircraft before it ever left the ground. The net result was that the Ju-187 was formally or informally canceled, becoming another footnote in the extensive list of World War II-era German aircraft projects that never saw combat. While some might see it as a missed opportunity for a revolutionary dive bomber, the consensus among historians is that by the time the Ju-187 could have been deployed, the strategic circumstances that made the original Stuka invaluable were long gone. Even though the Ju-187 never took flight, its legacy lives on in the imagination of aviation enthusiasts and historians. It exemplifies a phase in aircraft design where radical solutions were on the table, especially in Germany, which was at the forefront of aerospace experimentation in World War II. From jet engines to rocket propulsion to flying wings, German engineers had their hands in multiple groundbreaking concepts. The rotating tail Stuka was yet another manifestation of that relentless innovation. Now, in hypothetical scenarios, we can imagine that if Germany had produced the Ju-187 in, say, 1942, it might have been deployed in the Eastern Front's tank-busting role or in maritime attacks in the Mediterranean. With its improved speed and agility, it could have given Soviet or Allied ground forces a harder time, at least in theory, but realistically, its impact might have been limited by the same constraints that eventually grounded it: limited resources, the shift toward multi-role fighters, and Allied air superiority. A more interesting angle is whether the concept of a rotating tail might have found its way into post-war designs. After World War II, many German engineers went on to work in the aviation industries of other countries, most famously in the United States, Soviet Union, and Britain, through programs like Operational Paperclip. Yet no significant post-war aircraft ever featured a pivoting tailplane for the sake of improving rearward fire. Jet-age fighters evolved differently, prioritizing speed and agility over tailgun defense. As aerial tactics moved into the supersonic era, dogfights began taking place at higher altitudes and speeds, reducing the feasibility of the tailgunner concept altogether. Still, the Ju-187 remains a symbol of how warfare can spur incredible leaps in design thinking. It also serves as a cautionary tale. No matter how ingenious an idea might be, it can still be stymied by timing, resources, and evolving strategic demands. In a way, that duality, bold imagination meeting the cold reality of war, is at the heart of the aircraft's enduring mystique. World War II was a crucible of technological progress, accelerating innovation in radar, rocketry, and, of course, aircraft design. The Ju-187 underscores how quickly the demands of war can push engineers to try unorthodox solutions. Even though it never flew, it stands shoulder to shoulder with other experimental or failed projects that collectively shaped the direction of aviation in the post-war period. Look at how dive bombing itself evolved. During the early part of the war, it was a terror-inducing tactic, but by the end, even relatively outdated fighters could often intercept slow-moving dive bombers. The shift to fighter bombers that could defend themselves effectively was a game-changer, a lesson not lost on post-war air forces who focused heavily on multi-role jets. In broader historical perspective, the Ju-187 is a small but striking example of how desperate times breed desperate measures. By 1943 and 44, Germany's war machine was in serious trouble, yet they continued to pour resources into Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapons. Some, like the V-2 rocket, had a tangible impact on warfare's future course, leading to ballistic missile technology. Others, like the Ju-187, just remain curiosities. But these curiosities are still significant. They show the aspirations and shortcomings of a regime trying to out-innovate its enemies at breakneck speed. From a purely engineering standpoint, the Ju-187's rotating tail highlights the trade-offs involved in adding complexity to an already complex machine. Aviation engineers know well that every additional moving part is a potential failure point. We hope you found this video helpful. Might sound a bit modern, but even back then, had YouTube existed, you can bet the design team would have posted their prototypes to gather feedback from a wider community of fellow engineers and enthusiasts. But hey, jokes aside, that might have changed the design landscape entirely. Perhaps the biggest takeaway is that the best ideas in aviation often come from incremental improvements rather than quantum leaps. The Ju-187 tried to fix many issues at once: improved speed, better defense coverage, modern landing gear, and of course that pivoting tail. But in the end, it was too large a leap at the time when resources were running out. Nevertheless, that doesn't diminish the creativity involved in the attempt. The Ju-187 remains one of World War II's most intriguing what-ifs, an audacious dive bomber that never took to the skies but still captivates historians and aircraft enthusiasts. Its rotating tail is a testament to the boundless ingenuity and the equally formidable constraints of wartime aviation. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lost chapters of aircraft design, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and stick around for more fascinating content on experimental planes, legendary warbirds, and the stories behind them. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video.